This is part one of a two-part audio and video podcast with Clark Datchler of Johnny Hates Jazz. It's brought to you by Make a Difference with Records in conjunction with The Creative Well. Make a Difference with Records is a second-hand record store based in Godalming, Surrey, which donates all its proceeds to the Surrey mental health charity Catalyst. The Creative Well provides professional services supporting the mental health and well-being of those involved in the music industry. Follow us on Instagram under Make a Difference with Records, where you can also find updates on new stock and future podcasts. So, hello, I'm Anthony from Make a Difference with Records, and I'm here with Nadine Page from The Creative Well. And today we're very fortunate to have the opportunity to interview Clark Datchler. Of course, long solo career and also a very successful career with Johnny Hates Jazz. Welcome, Clark. Thanks for spending the time today.
Thank you.
So, Clark, you've had a successful career, both with Johnny Hates Jazz and as a solo artist. What do you think is key to that success?
Well, it's going to sound a bit predictable saying this, but it's mainly down to songs. I'm a great believer that, songs are the thing that give someone a sense of longevity in their career. And I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and the people who taught me to write were the great artists of those eras. And that was true of most of the people who emerged in the 80s. That's who they were influenced by. They were children of the 70s, really. Mm-hmm. So melody featured very, very strongly in what we listened to and then what we all created in that era. And that's still very, very important to me. I think the other thing, though, is that we grew up listening to music that was relevant to the times that they were written in, but also for future generations. They dealt with not just subjects about love and, things that are more personal, but also things that were global, socially oriented. That was very common in the 60s, 70s, and 80s to have big hit records high up in the charts that dealt with globally important issues. I think that's something that I miss these days in contemporary music, contemporary chart music, I should say. But I do think that that's a big part of why people resonated with what we did as Johnny Hates Jazz, what I've done on my own. And I can't think of making music any other way than that.
I think that's quite interesting to me because I think I've said to you time and time again, I'm completely in awe of your songwriting, and I find it really difficult to understand how someone so young back in the 1980s could have written those songs that are still relevant today and have meaning, today. So, that's interesting to hear you talk about that. How do you feel like your songwriting has changed since the late 1980s?
That's a really good question, Nadine. Very good question. I'm tempted to give quite a technical answer, so I will. One of the ways it's changed is that I used to be much more chordal in my writing. In other words, I used to use more chords. And I grew up in a house full of jazz, believe it or not, with the name of the band being Johnny Hates Jazz. But my dad was a very successful jazz musician, so I grew up listening to Ella Fitzgerald and Nat King Cole, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Dizzy Gillespie, and that had a huge effect on how I wrote music because I tended to use chords that were perhaps you'd more associate with people like Stevie Wonder and Earth, Wind and Fire and those people, but I wasn't an R&B artist. So that's changed over the years because chords have been sadly simplified, and I've adopted that really from a desire to communicate with people. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've thought, I've reached a certain point in life where I'm going to delve back into being technically more complex. I think that as we get older, of course, you would like to think that through life experience, at the minimum, we get a little bit wiser. So my lyrics tend to be mainly socially oriented now, whereas when I was in my early 20s, they were, I would say half of them were socially oriented. So I don't think there's any time to waste these days. We have so many pressing issues that need to be addressed in many, many ways, but music should be a part of finding a solution to the problems we face. So I feel a responsibility to do that.
Thank you. And what comes first usually? Is it the melody or Is it the lyrics?
What did Eddie say? I'm really curious.
I think his story changes all the time.
I don't blame him.
I'm not sure we asked him that question, to be honest.
Oh, really?
We might have done.
No, I think I did
But
ask
neither
him,
of us can
so
remember, so-
I can't remember what he said, but I think he did say that. I think probably the melody comes first. I think that's what he said.
Well, it's funny when I'm talking to different artists. You either get, well, I just get this kind of idea, so I get inspired. I've got a story I want to tell, and then that gives rise to a few kind of core lyrical ideas, and then the melody comes afterwards. But it varies so hugely. But for you, it's...
But that's so interesting, because I think there is a bit of that. I think there is, for people who are more lyrically or poetically oriented, you tend to think about, what do I want to write about now? It's not quite as random as I think sometimes it appears when you hear writers talk about it. So I do that. I'll say, okay, I want to address this subject.
Yeah.
And often a title will come. And the title then gives rise to melody and lyric at the same time. It's rare that I'll come up with one or the other separately, because for me, they always work in tandem. When you think about, this is a very difficult phrase, a great song. People band it about left, right, and centre. It's so subjective. But when you think about the great songs that I would think about as being that, they are a combination of beautifully written melodies, beautifully written lyrics. And somehow they work in sync perfectly. So I find that as I'm writing, I could come up with a totally different lyric that wouldn't have made that song complete. But because the lyric was the one that came to my mind as the melody came to my mind, somehow that's the entirety of it. So, and then, of course, you have to refine these things. It's never, I'm never someone who writes in one fell swoop and it is done. I spend months trying to get something right.
And I think you also said on one of your Journey songs recently that you need to be in your space. What did you mean by that?
Well, there's two things. One is a physical space. I think that many musicians, I think artists in general, I think actually people in general need a sense of space where they can really feel expressive, they can be themselves, and that is a physical thing, I think.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily have to be internal. It can be, with a tree. It can be in a forest or by the coast, but sometimes it's actually a room. So that's one thing. But no, I have to get into a space, which sometimes takes work, because we're all busy. We all have lives beyond what we do creatively, and those things can take us into spaces which are not particularly creative. So I'm very nature-oriented. The way I'll get into writing is to go out and walk with the land. And that clears my head. I find that I start to listen more to what is in my own mind, what appears to be external to me that is influencing me. And I think nature sometimes has the loudest, clearest, and most beautiful voice of any of us.
Thank you. And I was going to ask you about your influences. I know you've mentioned a few there, Ella Fitzgerald, etc. But who and what influences you? I mean, was your father a great influence for you as well?
He was, Nadine, yeah. He was a massive influence on me, because there were two reasons for that. We didn't see eye to eye musically. That's typical. It's a generational thing. It's very boring. I look back and think, why did I even have arguments with him about that? He was right. But no, and also it was that he had been successful. Now, that might sound quite shallow, but let's put it into context. You're a kid growing up in the 60s, 70s, 80s in the UK, and one of my biggest fears was not finding out who I was and what I felt I was meant to do here in life. And back then, and I think this is still true today, music was it. Music was the lifeline. It was the avenue, and that avenue was undoubtedly carved by the Beatles. That was one of the biggest things they did, was say to the kids back home, you can do this. It's not easy, but you can do this. And so seeing my dad do that gave me this sense of, yeah, I could do something meaningful to me and hopefully meaningful to other people. But then in terms of other musicians, without meaning to say too much about what we're going to be talking about soon, I because I'm song oriented and not genre oriented, okay. I'm not even artist oriented. There were certain songs that just overwhelmed me, and they could be from any area. I mean, for example, I was a huge Beatles and Stevie Wonder fan.
Yes.
So Nowhere Man was an important song for me because it spoke about my fears that John Lennon was articulating about himself. And likewise, there's many songs I could mention from Stevie Wonder, but there were other songs like Long Live Rock and Roll by Rainbow, Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow, was huge for me. It was just the energy of it, and I wasn't listening to the lyric particularly there, thinking, oh, what is he referring to? It was just the energy of it. So there were Sex Pistols records that I just thought were great. Yeah, it's a question of a song that resonates with you.
Yeah.
And sort of moving it on from there, but kind of sticking with the theme of the songwriting, although you co-wrote a few songs as part of Johnny Hate Jazz, a lot of those songs were your songs and you wrote them. But much more recently, you've been doing some co-writing with Mike Rutherford. And I know that, for example, the last two albums, that you did about 11 or 12 different songs. What was it like moving into that real co-writing collaboration space, particularly with someone that I don't think you'd worked with Mike before, as I understand it. What was that like for you? How challenging was it?
That's a good question. You've got good questions today. You should do this more often.
So if you're watching, folks.
I had tried co-writing a little bit because that's how songs tend to get written these days. And rarely just two writers. You know, you often see the credits as being 9, 10, 11, 12 writers. How does that work? I don't know. And I didn't like the process. I generally am a solitary writer, and if I have co-written in the distant past, it's been with people who have been close to me. Mm-hmm. So I've immediately had a rapport with them. When the opportunity came about to write with Mike Rutherford, it was a totally different situation. This is Mike Rutherford. He's from Genesis. You know, what could I learn from that? That's what I felt. So we did a tryout day. You know, Mike doesn't live that far away from me, so we had a tryout day, and it was very much kind of, well, we'll see how it goes. Yeah. And I think in the first 2 hours we had at least two of the song ideas that went on to the album Let Me Fly as ideas.
I think
anyway.
you did, in fact, the title track, wasn't that?
It was one of them, yeah. And then Andrew Rochford, who is, you know, one of the singers in the second generation Mike and Mechanics, was very involved in co-writing as well, as was Tim Howard with some of them, the other singer. But my thing with Mike Rutherford was, apart from the fact that he's a lovely fella, is that he just exudes experience without saying a word about it. He's not one to band about his success or much of his history. But he'll answer if you ask him, and I asked him a lot.
Yes.
But I'll never forget when he played me a melodic idea which turned into a song called "Don't Know What Came Over Me," which was the first single.
Quite tragic.
Very tragic. Yeah. So he played the chorus idea, and he was saying, Mike tends to, you know, he's got lots of ideas, so he talks quite quickly, but he quickly said, quickly play this. So he played this. I said, Mike, you've got to stop. That's brilliant. And it was a moment when I'm looking at him thinking, this is Mike Rutherford. You know, no wonder he's so well regarded at the very least. He's really, really great at what he does. So I could go on for a long time about.
But did you end up, though, having to compromise on a lot of ideas? So you got the genesis of a song, but that wasn't meant to be.
That was good, though.
So you've got the genesis of an idea, whether it was you or Andrew or Mike, and then that grows into something else. And at some point, you've got a lot of ideas buzzing around the room. Did you find you had to hold things back at some point? Yeah,
absolutely. And I got overruled because it wasn't my album. You know, I was Andrew and Mike, obviously, it's their band, especially Mike. Yeah. And that's something, having not done much professional co-writing, I had to get used to. And I could only get used to it because it was Mike. And Andrew's a great fella as well, so it was really easy with both of them. And Tim, lovely people. So I think that, yes, I had to learn that and also accept that I was contributing to them. They weren't contributing to me. And that was really my honour. At the end of the day, I thought, wow, what an honour this has been.
And, you know, very different approaches, as I understand it. I mean, Mike sort of is more sort of some chords, maybe starting with a drum machine to start writing songs. You're very piano orientated. So, I mean, how did those kind of worlds collide, as it were?
Well, I showed up there with my stage piano, digital piano, and Mike, as soon as the first time I met him actually, I had met him before in the 80s on the promotional circuit, and it was always really lovely meeting. He was such a nice fella. But when he first played on that first day, first played guitar, it was immediately, this could be no one else. His chords, his inversions were and are absolutely unique to him. And so I found that very inspiring. So that was the first thing. It was like, oh, this just sounds like Genesis. He automatically does that because he is that, you know, the main writer. Yeah. I've lost the train of thought now. What were we talking about?
I was going to get to an argument with you about whether Mike was the main writer of Genesis, but I'll leave that one alone.
Well, as you know, during the last Genesis tour, Phil makes a point of acknowledging Mike as, you know, an absolutely brilliant writer. Is he the main writer? Of course, there's many things to be said. We're not really talking about Peter and Steve and
it's the sum of
Phil
the parts.
himself.
It's the sum of the parts with bands, often, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And Tony, who I've worked with, you know, Mike will say Tony is, you know, like the linchpin. So, who knows?
What did you do with Tony?
Many years ago, when I was in Johnny Hates Jazz, I did a track with him that was going to be for a solo album.
Was that the Still album? Because I think he did a lot of... he introduced a lot of vocalists for that album.
It might well have been.
People like Fish and others.
It might well have been. I can't remember.
Okay.
But I think at the time I was falling out with Virgin, and this was on Virgin.
Okay.
And they were keen for me not to be involved, so that was a shame. But ironically, I've always had this relationship with Genesis, because I was based at Real World Studios for years, so I met Peter quite a lot.
Studios.
Yeah. So anyway, how Mike works and how I work came together really well, because of course he's not a keyboard player, I am, I'm not a guitarist, he is, and we both have drum machines in common, in particular MPCs. And MPCs are mainly used now by the rap and hip hop world. But they were introduced to me by Peter Gabriel, who said to me, when he first showed me his studio down at Werewolf, he said, come and have a look at this. And he showed me this MPC. He said, this is absolutely incredible. And lo and behold, that's what Mike uses. And Mike is brilliant on it, Mike Rutherford. He's just really good. He will say that then you get Phil involved. With, you know, Mike puts down these little grooves and then Phil gets involved and it becomes a different ball game, which I'm sure is true. But Mike's great on this. So I love the fact, because that's how I write often with MPCs, with drum machines. I love the fact that he did that. So I was kind of at home immediately.
So listen, I'm going to get us into a heap of trouble if we continue down this road, because I could talk about this stuff for hours. So we've talked a lot about the songwriting side of you. We now want to kind of focus really on, I guess, what I've called Clark the campaigner.
Over to me. Yeah, so you're not known just for your songwriting, you're also known for your campaigning as well. And you've been campaigning on climate change for many years now. For example, back in 2007, you wrote the song Power. How do you think your music and the music of others can influence behaviours of this essential topic?
That, again, brilliant question. No, these are not normal questions. The thing is that the fact of the matter is that when I wrote, I created an album called Tomorrow, which came out in 2007. It was an environmentally oriented album, and it was, I thought, was going to be an album that would contribute to the debate that was beginning to happen more and more about what we were doing to the planet. But the media wasn't supporting that debate at the time. And I mean, the notion of climate change, even as a phrase, was very minimally used. And this was only 2007. It wasn't a long time ago. I mean, I could go back further. In 1990, I released an album called Rain Dance, my first solo album. And Rain Dance, the title track, was about what we were doing to the planet. And in terms of interest, it was just not something that people really wanted to associate with pop music. So, ironically, the songs that I wrote for Tomorrow have now become very relevant, and the terminology that I use is now used, as a matter of commonplace in the media. And it really does take all aspects of social interaction to give music a chance to make a difference. It can't do it on its own, especially not in this time when everyone and their hamster can release music on the streaming services. Mm-hmm. So, do I think music can still have an effect? Absolutely. But you've got to support it. There's a lot of music that is supported that is very entertaining, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if that's all there is, we're only left with entertainment. And then all you can rely on is campaigners and politicians and business people to fix the planet's problems. Well, artists have always been integral to that, so they've got to be supported, which is wonderful, the fact that you've invited me here to speak to you, because I see that as support as well. I hope that musicians are encouraged and that we let them know that they will be supported if they want to write about these issues, not just speak about them, write about them.
Yeah. I think we're huge supporters of what you're doing in terms of campaigning and how that music contributes to that. And beyond the environmental change, you've just relaunched, haven't you, a reworking of Shattered Dreams in support of the Ukraine, and in particular the work that's going on in Poland with refugees. How did that come about, and how do you think that's been received?
So Shattered Dreams of Ukraine, which is what it's called, is a new solo recording of mine of the song. And the fact of the matter is that the refugee crisis in Ukraine has slipped down the media ladder quite a bit. It's not really getting reported, but it's still happening. And if the UNHCR predictions are correct, there's going to be a mass exodus from parts of Ukraine this winter because, of course, the infrastructure is being damaged so much by the war. So I was connected with a charity called Poland Welcomes, which is located in the east of the country, in a place called Yarosław. And they have an amazing story. They came together, former high school friends, in February this year, 2022, and immediately realized they had a problem. They were right on the border with Ukraine. There were thousands of people coming across the border, and they needed to do something to help. They realized that. So they created this charity, Poland Welcomes. They now run 4 sizable refugee shelters. And I went over to see them recently, and I met a young man there, 13, 14 years old, called Daniel. And Daniel was, very upstanding, ready to kind of be an adult in one way, but also terribly lost. This was really confronting to me, that I hadn't really thought about it in this context. These people have been ripped from their everyday lives and their sense of future. And this young lad, Daniel, he'd been taken away from his school friends, maybe a partner, a love, his hopes for the future. And there he was in this teenager's room at the shelter with a punch bag hanging in it. And he wanted to show me how good he was at boxing. And clearly what he was doing was expressing his rage and sadness at what has happened to him. Mm-hmm. And that affected me profoundly. And it made me think that, Shattered Dreams is actually a very applicable song. It's not just the metaphorical dreams that have been shattered. It's even the amount of shattered glass there is everywhere, which apparently is a huge problem in Ukraine from the war. So yeah, I had this version of the song and decided to team up with Poland Welcomes. I had some wonderful people collaborate with me in making the video, getting press coverage. It only came out less than a week ago, as we speak now. And it's been very promising. It's been very promising, but we need to continue to get media support.
It's a very moving video. Lyrically, the song pretty much remained the same, but there was one subtle change I noticed. Do you want to just mention that and what the message was with that?
There are actually a few subtle changes, but I'm glad you even found one of them.
I did that. I'll die for you.
Oh yes, you said you'd die for me.
Yeah.
Yes, which is repeated throughout.
Yeah, but it comes in earlier in the song, and I thought maybe you were just giving a message with that.
Yes, I was, and I wanted to be very careful with this track because there are a lot of people from Russia who have written to me before the single came out, before they knew there was going to be this single, and afterwards, who clearly feel horribly misrepresented by this conflict.
Yes.
And I really get that. So this was very much pointed at the promises given by the Russian leadership to the people of Ukraine and how that's been broken so badly.
Yeah.
But I think also there are some other changes. It's a slower, more soulful rendition.
It's a beautiful
of
version of it,
cool.
The piano in particular.
Cool.
I think lyrically and the piano go very well together. It's very moving, particularly with the video, some very hard to take images in the video, which of course is the point.
It is.
It needs to be.
And I was very fortunate. I should say, by the way, that all proceeds, download streams, go to Poland Welcomes. I'm really encouraging people to go to polandwelcomes.org if they can. I know these times are tough right now, but to try and make a donation themselves. But
well, the original Shattered Dreams, I discovered, has 54 million downloads. So if you could get a fraction of that for this new version, that would be amazing.
It would be amazing, yeah. And so, these things have the benefit of these times, and the fact that streaming is so prevalent now, is that theoretically, records don't have a shelf life anymore in terms of how they get promoted. They can exist there and people can discover them. And so I think we're in it for the long haul with Shattered Dreams of Ukraine.
Yeah. And I don't know why this came to me, but this idea and thought came to me. I don't know whether therefore it's really a question or a comment, so bear with me. I was listening to I Don't Want to Die a Hero, and you talk about the red, white and blue, and it just happens that the Russian flag is red, white and blue. And it struck me that in the same way Shattered Dreams is maybe a message to the world about Ukraine, that could be a message to the mothers and fathers of Russia, in a sense, so for what it's worth.
I think that's very insightful, very insightful. And I hadn't thought about the colours of the Russian flag, because when I wrote I Don't Want to Be a Hero in my early 20s, probably late teens at that point actually, obviously I was referring to Britain. But it applies to a lot of countries who seem to have red, white and blue as the colour of their flags for some reason. Yes, it's very applicable to Russia, and I agree, no one's winning in this conflict. There'll be a resolution, there'll be an end, but I can't see anyone actually winning. So yeah, I agree.
So the Ukrainian conflict is fundamentally sad on so many levels. A lot of the suffering is physical, but a lot of the suffering is mental, the mental anguish that people are going through, and the world is going through, just having to kind of sit and watch what is happening, and you've been trying to do something in your own way through Shattered Dreams of Ukraine, but you've also been a supporter on the mental health side generally. I know, for example, you're an ambassador to the Creative Well, which is Nadine's organisation. Where do you see music being the biggest influence in the context of mental health for good?
Well, I think for me, this comes down to something I said earlier. It's all very well for people like myself to speak about it and to have concerns about it. But the reason I'm here is that I'm a musician and I'm a songwriter. So that really should be my main vehicle for communicating about this issue. And I think that one thing that happens with musicians is they tend to write to form a shield in front of them where they don't have to expose what's really going on inside them to such a great degree. I think that's actually partly because of the rise of entertainment-oriented chart music, that people have felt more comfortable doing that and felt more able to do it. Whereas, again, as I was referencing, when I was younger, writers tended to be more open and more introspective in that way. But I think it has to play a fundamentally important part. And in this regard, whereas I tend to write about big subjects from a broad perspective, obviously when you're dealing with mental health, you've really got to look at yourself first and foremost. And I've been on my own journey with this. I've had my highs and lows, and I've sought help, and there's been times when I should have sought help and I didn't, and times when I've just needed to be in my own thoughts. And there are songs that I've written over the years, one in particular called The Road Not Taken, which is on the album, my solo album Tomorrow, which is actually going to be part of a forthcoming collection called Journey Songs 2. And The Road Not Taken, which is named after the famous poem by Robert Frost, is really about me dealing with the regrets that I've had in my life. And the chorus, the lyrical chorus is, the road not taken, the path forsaken, and though my heart is breaking, ain't it time to move on? And then the rest of the song, goes into more detail as to what I'm referring to. And I think those kind of things that are basically saying, I have my struggles too, are important because we all need mirrors. And I think music is something that people have often moved towards to find solace. And if it's musical solace, that can be wonderful. But if it's also lyrical solace, where someone can say, that's how I feel, that's what I've been going through, it makes you feel like you're just not as alone anymore.
Yes.
So that's, I think, the role that it needs to play. But again, we've got to encourage people to write about it more.
So the reason Nadine and I sort of got together, as it were, was that we were kind of coming at the same subject from slightly different angles. So we, raised funds for the Surrey Mental Health Charity Catalyst through the selling of vinyl and CD. That's basically what we do. That's where the idea came from. And then Nadine provides professional services to the music industry. And there's been a lot of well-publicised issues in the industry, people having to cancel tours, a lot of kind of mental health related issue. More recently, we've had the startup of the Music Minds Matter initiative. Is that something that you feel is long overdue, or do you think the support system's always been there for people in the industry?
Oh, I don't think it has been there. I actually think, in particular, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, Nadine, Nadine's idea with the Creative Well, for me, was entirely unique, is entirely unique. And I think is more and more needed, actually, because of the way that performers are exposed now in multiple ways for multiple hours of the day.
Yes.
I think that the world of social media has opened up an amazing set of opportunities, but it is a treacherous world. And I think, I must say, if I was a young musician now, I think I'd be finding it very difficult. I don't think the path is clear anymore. And I think that you're almost, I was saying earlier about needing mirrors. Well, actually, you want to choose what those mirrors are.
Yeah.
I think on social media, everyone's just exposed themselves to any kind of mirror that appears in front of them. And that can be positive, it can be negative, it can be kind, it can be unkind. It can be well thought out and ill thought out. So I think to have someone or some people within the industry who are there to offer some support, especially as we're going to get further and further into the realm of the internet dominating what happens on music, I think is really critical.
So if you were advising your young self, but not in 1987 when you were starting out, now, what advice would you give yourself as a musician?
I've often thought that, actually. And I think that the thing that I would probably focus on is to be mindful as to whose advice I listen to.
Yes.
And to not think that I know it all. And I certainly did. And it wasn't that I was particularly arrogant. I think I was just typically arrogant. And from one of my own personal regrets is not listening to my father more about what I was about to face in music. And he did try to warn me.
Yes.
So I think that would be the first bit of advice. You know what? The rest of it, though, I would say to the young me, you know what you've got to do. Keep the bar high, creatively, but also in terms of what I'm willing to do and what I'm not willing to do. And focus on the songs. Focus on the message in the songs, the melody of the songs, because if I feel that that's reflecting who I am,
Yes.
well, then I'm pretty well set to deal with what's in front of me.
Yeah. And if you'd have taken your own advice, do you think you'd have left Johnny Hates Jazz briefly in 1980? Well, not briefly, for an extended period in 1988?
It's a really tough one because, you know, life faces us with different doors sometimes, doesn't it? And sometimes two doors open at once and you've got to make the decision which is which.
Yes.
So in some ways, I think I made the right decision because I'm happy with who I am. I'm happy with who I became. I've still got work to do. I'm still a bit of a rough diamond, but I'm happy with the way life unfolded because I had some incredible experiences.
Yeah.
But that said, and this goes back to the song I mentioned, The Road Not Taken, there is a sense of regret there, and I think that that's human, to ask yourself, what if? And you don't want to dwell there, you don't want to live there, you don't want to be burdened by it. But I think it's okay to look at it sometimes.
Yeah.
And I have looked at it because I rejoined Johnny Hates Jazz 20 years after leaving.
Yes.
And I think that part of me thinks I should have stayed. But this goes back to advice. When I was younger, we as a band didn't have management.
Yeah.
And we did a lot by just managing ourselves. And I have to say, although we didn't meet the right person, I'm not sure we sought them out either. And there were different people in my life that I wished I had gone to for advice and that I had been mature enough to listen to them. Beyond my dad, Mickey Most, the legendary record producer, you know, I was signed to his label for quite a few years as a solo artist, and Mickey, I think, was in a position to give really good advice, and I wished I had listened more and asked more.
Yes.
So I guess that's you just helped me answer the question. Ask more, listen more.
So during lockdown, Clark, you started a regular stream on Facebook called Journey Songs, where you talked about what the story was behind creating those songs, and it's continued to this day, and it kept us going through lockdown, so thank you very much for that. Looked forward to the weekends. What do you think the success amongst your fan base has been?
I think that the most successful aspect of Journey Songs for people who were already into my music was that they've gotten to know me better. And the fact is they didn't know me well. That's how I wanted it. That's how, again, growing up in the 60s and 70s, musicians were more enigmatic than they are now. And I personally liked that. But I thought in this time when people tend to want to communicate with the individual and know their story in order to decide if they're going to resonate with their music, I thought, okay, I'm going to let people know who I am and what I've done, because there were many years when people didn't know what I was doing, and it was a very unusual story. So the most successful part of Journey Songs has been people being open to listening to not just what I've done throughout my life, but also I tend to extrapolate upon each song that I've written in a much broader and deeper context than perhaps just the song itself. And it's amazing how people respond, because of course they're answering me in real time, as you know, Nadine, through comments that I see on the screen.
Yes.
And if I can, I'll answer them. And some of their comments are so perceptive. I mean, I stop and read them sometimes, and I have to pause, live on air, and think to myself, that is brilliantly articulated, much better than what I was saying. So it's very much a back and forth. But Journey Songs is going to continue beyond my own songs. I've decided that it's going to become bigger, and next year it will start to focus on other people's music and not just mine. So I'm really looking forward to that, because the idea will be the same, where you will take a song, you'll get the initial answer to what the song was about, and then you'll go deeper and deeper. And so suddenly it becomes about sometimes a totally different subject. And I hope people will continue to resonate with that.
I think I learned quite a lot from watching that. One of the biggest things was I realised what a great songwriter you are. And I say that because, the answers that you gave were not what I thought the song was about. And I think that is a sign of a really good songwriter. I know nothing about songwriting, but actually the fact that you resonated with me, and it was nothing about what you were writing about, but I could put my own story to it. And I realised how many stories I make up in my head about different songs. And, other people would say something different, and then you would come on and you would say something completely different. So I think that really has got to be one of the key things to a good songwriter, that you can resonate with different people at different times on different levels. That's what I learned. What did you learn from doing it?
I think that's such a good point. And it is true that a lot of people will say to a songwriter, not just me, I didn't realise that's what it was about. I always thought that. And that's fine. It doesn't matter. It's because that wasn't intentional. But as long as it means something to someone and it is in some way supportive, then that's the most important thing. I think for me, what I'd learned from that was that for me, contemporary music across the ages is, I mentioned poetry before, is still part poetry. It's a modern form of poetry set to music. And if you think about the great poets of the past, let's say the so-called romantic poets of Britain, they weren't romantic at all, really. They were revolutionaries, but they were often the rock stars of their day. I mean, Lord Byron was that. He would have been Bowie. There are those who are completely overlooked, who we now regard as the great Percy Shelley or William Blake, totally overlooked in their lifetimes, which is criminal. I can think of many musicians who have been overlooked in their time, that in contemporary music, that should have been given an opportunity. But I think what it taught me was that when I write lyrics, that the poetry of something is going to determine how it communicates.
Yes.
So words are powerful things, really powerful things. And sometimes as I've gotten older, I've thought, do I really want to say that? Do I really want to phrase it that way? Because it could be interpreted in a way that is actually not positive. Yeah. So especially if you've got a bee in your bonnet, or you care emphatically about something, you have to sometimes temper it, because you don't want people to put up barriers when they hear it. You don't want people to feel attacked. You want people to feel invited, and then maybe question through the song. So I think that's what I've got out of it.
And then finally, looking ahead we're nearly at the end of 22 already, looking ahead into 2023, over and above the Journey songs that you've talked about evolving, what are your plans from a songwriting, performing perspective?
Well, obviously my main focus is Shattered Dreams of Ukraine. Yes. There's going to be one of the offshoots of the Journey Songs live stream is that I released earlier this year a triple album called Journey Songs 1, which was a collection of my solo recordings from the early 90s. There's going to be a Journey Songs 2 early next year, which is another triple album, which is includes the album Tomorrow and other recordings I did around it, and especially the period of my life when I was living close to Native Americans in the US. So that has a very particular perspective. It's more I think, more thought-provoking than my early work in some ways. And then, of course, there is, Johnny Hates Jazz is still
Yes.
very much, alive and kicking. So we will continue to fight the good fight. And so I think next year is an open book, but I get the feeling that it's going to be a busy one.
Okay. On that note, Clark, we'll leave it there. That's the end of part 1.
Thank you,
And
Anthony.
join us for part 2. Check out part 2 of this podcast and look out for our other podcasts on our channel, That's My Vinyl Answer. Follow us on Instagram under Make a Difference with Records, where you can also find updates on new stock and future podcasts. The Creative Well can also be found on Instagram and at thecreativewell.com.